Bueno, buenos días para todos y todas. Good morning for everyone. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la séptima edición de Academia contra la Corrupción en las Américas. Welcome to everyone to the seventh Academia Against Corruption in the Americas. Ah, Mi nombre es Giovanna Rodríguez García. Soy investigadora postdoctoral en la Universidad Autónoma de Bucaramanga y miembro de la Red Academia en contra de la Corrupción en las Américas desde más o menos el 2002, quizás un poco antes, donde he tenido la oportunidad de presentar en diferentes sesiones. Algunos de ustedes ya me conocen, me han visto presentando en acá y en otros espacios donde compartimos nuestra pasión por los estudios de corrupción y anticorrupción. Aquí les dejo al auditorio también la galería de todas las personas que tenemos que se han conectado online a nuestro evento. Mm, Hoy tengo el privilegio de participar en este evento y de presentar este evento en mi país. Esta es la primera edición de ACA fuera de México y se está realizando en Bogotá. Me siento muy honrada por ello. Y durante los próximos 3 días, pues vamos a estar compartiendo 6 paneles académicos y 3 paneles especiales. De estos paneles especiales, uno es dedicado a los practicantes anticorrupción, otro está centrado en la enseñanza y la formación para la anticorrupción y otro panel está liderado por nuestro anfitrión, el Observatorio Fiscal de la Universidad Javeriana, quien nos ha dado el, nos ha dado el placer de hostearnos en esta ocasión aquí en Bogotá y estamos pues muy contentos todos de estar en este momento acá. Bueno, tenemos 3 ponencias magistrales durante esta sesión. La primera ponencia, pues, a cargo de Bonnie Palifka, que ustedes ya conocen, es nuestra fundadora, la fundadora de ACA, que se encuentra, bueno, en estos momentos va a presentar. Y ella abrirá con una ponencia sobre la corrupción y la anticorrupción en la última década en las Américas. El día de mañana tendremos a Sandra Martínez de Transparencia por Colombia, quien nos va a hablar sobre una herramienta que están utilizando, que han diseñado ellos, que es el Monitor Ciudadano. Y el viernes tenemos a Sergio Fajardo, quien cerrará con una reflexión sobre el papel de la educación y la transparencia como herramienta clave en la lucha anticorrupción. El programa completo lo pueden consultar en el enlace que está por ahí en los flyers que tenemos, si no, ahorita se los pongo en el link, en la página, en la registro, para que lo puedan consultar. Agradecemos profundamente al Observatorio Fiscal de la Universidad Pontificia, de la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, al Tecnológico de Monterrey, a la UNAP, y al ICETEX, que son parte de nuestros patrocinadores por hacer posible este evento. Y ahora cedo la palabra a Mauricio Salazar, que es el directorio del Observatorio Fiscal de la Universidad Javeriana. Bueno, muchas gracias. Esperamos que sea un gran evento.
Muy buenos días para todas y todos. Es un verdadero honor darles la bienvenida en nombre de la Universidad Javeriana y el Observatorio Fiscal a esta séptima edición de la Conferencia de la Academia contra la Corrupción en las Américas. Nos alegra profundamente ser anfitriones de este espacio, que como bien mencionaba Giovanna, es la primera vez que viene a la región. Es la primera vez que viene a la región y una región que, como sabemos en estadísticas, es la región más desigual del mundo, la región que tiene más crimen en el mundo y una de las regiones donde la corrupción duele mucho más quizás por estas dimensiones mencionadas. Entonces, el objetivo de esta conferencia va a ser entender y combatir la corrupción desde el conocimiento riguroso, el diálogo crítico y la acción colectiva. Saludo especialmente a Giovanna Rodríguez García de la Universidad Autónoma de Bucaramanga, coorganizadora y aliada clave en este evento. A Bonnie Palifka, fundadora de ACA, quien nos ha inspirado en su visión regional, a todas las personas ponentes y participantes que han venido desde distintos países y regiones. Y por supuesto a nuestra comunidad académica y ciudadana que hoy nos acompaña. También quisiera dar un agradecimiento especial a Ana María Sánchez, comunicadora observatorio, quien ha hecho todo por este evento y Claudia Prieto también de la universidad, que ha hecho mucho porque este evento se dé. Durante esos 3 días tendremos la oportunidad de reflexionar sobre temas urgentes: la innovación tecnológica en el control de la corrupción, el papel de las ciencias sociales y económicas en su comprensión, las experiencias locales, los enfoques desde género y juventud, y las herramientas fiscales como mecanismo de transformación. Esperemos que este espacio no solo deje aprendizajes, sino también nuevas alianzas y una renovada motivación para seguir trabajando con instituciones y gobiernos más íntegros, abiertos y en servicio al bien común. Gracias por estar aquí, por creer en el poder del conocimiento y por sumarse a este esfuerzo colectivo por una región más justa. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la Universidad Javeriana, y pues esperemos que estos 3 días estén llenos de comunicación, aprendizaje y soñar y luchar por una región con cada vez menos corrupción. Muchas gracias.
Ok, bueno, vamos a dar paso entonces a la primera conferencia magistral que está a cargo de Bonnie Palifka, directora y fundadora de ACA y también investigadora asociada, profesora del Tecnológico de Monterrey. Su ponencia se titula A Decade of Corruption and Anti-Corruption in the Americas. La doctora Bonnie es doctora y maestra en economía por la Universidad de Texas en Austin. Es licenciada en economía y de estudios de América Latina de la Universidad de Vermont. Es profesora del Departamento de Economía del Tecnológico de Monterrey desde 1998. También ha impartido clases en Yale University desde 2011 y en 2004 diseñó y empezó a impartir el curso pionero La economía de la corrupción en el Tecnológico de Monterrey. Ha impartido versiones de esta materia en Yale. Su enfoque en la corrupción también la ha llevado a participar en conferencias en el Banco Mundial y las Naciones Unidas. Es fundadora y organizadora de la conferencia Academia contra la Corrupción en las Américas y ha consultado para Transparencia Internacional y la Oficina de Drogas y el Crimen de las Naciones Unidas. Es miembro del Consejo Académico Internacional de la International Anti-Corruption Academy en Austria y recibió el premio Rómulo Garza por la segunda edición del libro Corrupción y Gobierno, Causas, Consecuencias y Reformas, en coautoría con Susan Rose Ackerman, un libro que todos hemos conocido, citado muchas veces y que siempre nos encanta referenciarlo. También ha sido distinguida como profesora honoraria por la Universidad de UT en Ecuador. Sus temas de investigación actuales incluyen la captura del Estado por parte del crimen organizado y la medición de la corrupción en el contexto de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Entonces, Bonnie, te damos la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias, Giovanna, por esa presentación. Mi ponencia va a estar en inglés, pero tengo las filminas en español, esperando que todos me puedan comprender. So I'm going to be speaking in English, but my slides are in Spanish. I hope that I can reach a wider audience this way. I'll be speaking today on a decade of corruption and anti-corruption in the Americas, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I can't cover everything, but I'm going to start out looking at some data. What do the data tell us? Then we're going to be looking at some classic cases, the CICIG in Guatemala, the Lava Jato case in Brazil, and the Panama Papers and other similar leaks that have come out since 2014, 2015. Then we'll look at some special topics kind of quickly. The United States as regional and world leader plays an important role, and it's important to look at what has been happening there. We'll look at COVID-19 and how that has changed the scenario over the last decade, and what I like to call mafiocracy, state capture by organized crime. So let's look first at the data. What can they tell us about corruption in this region over the past decade? This is the latest Corruption Perceptions Index. What we can see here is that, well, the distribution is about the same as the world distribution. So we cannot say that Latin America is anomalously corrupt. It's not the most corrupt region in the world. It's about normal for the world. We have 11 countries that are above 50, so they're in the top half, and 2 countries in the 70s, Uruguay and Canada. We'd like to have more, and we'd like to have higher scores, but that's all sort of the good stuff. Not so good. Two-thirds of these countries are below 50, as with the rest of the world. And the ugly, we have 3 countries that are in very bad shape and that might be called either failed states or autocracies. Haiti at 16, Nicaragua at 14, and Venezuela at 10. So the Corruption Perceptions Index is the most cited source of data. It has its own issues, but it's a good jumping off point. If we look within the region, so this is focusing on the Caribbean, what we see is a lot of persistence. We see a lot of persistence in the region. My bad. I thought there was a slide there that showed a slow downturn in corruption in the region that apparently I deleted. And so what we see is a lot of persistence in the Caribbean, some ups and downs, but mostly they're staying within the same range of where they've been over the decade. We do see a bit of an opening of the difference between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which, as you know, are neighbors on the same island after about 2021. As you may be aware, Haiti has lost its ability to govern and has been mostly overrun by gangs at this point. But the Dominican Republic has been improving. In Mesoamerica, we see Costa Rica, the far outlier in the region for the whole time, and but again, mostly persistent. There's a slight decline in several of the countries, but not statistically significant, with the exception perhaps of Nicaragua. In South America, again, lots of persistence. Uruguay and Chile are outliers, are stars in the region, though we do see Chile with a decline over the last decade. In South America, in the lower regions, we see Venezuela, of course, with this severe deterioration in the corruption situation as well as other areas. You can see there's I don't seem to have a pointer. The more solid line, that is this solid line here, that's Colombia. Again, very persistent. Looking further to the north, the United States and Canada, both of which have declined over the past decade. In 2019, the United States dropped below 70 for the first time and has not recovered since. And of course, that was during the first Trump administration. He is not solely to blame for that, as we'll discuss later, but he did have a big impact on the corruption situation in the United States. And then these are data from the State Capture Index. I've marked that vertical line is just sort of marking the last decade, and we can see that there has been a very strong increase in state capture in this region over the past decade. Again, it's only an increase from about 50.5 to 51.75, so perhaps not even statistically significant, but the tendency is troubling. We do have some countries that are doing well. Again, the Dominican Republic has improved by 19 points. That's the bar on the bottom. For some reason, not showing up with a label. And Trinidad and Tobago also are net improvers, and we actually have a representative presenting during this conference. So on the bad side, there is this increase in state capture, and most of the countries are showing an increase in state capture. And the worst of these are Brazil, with a fall of 18 points, Nicaragua falling 14 points, and the United States falling 8 points, which again, not good. Looking at the sub-indices, actually, the only sub-index that's really causing this is captured political access and policy. And so if we look at the United States, for example, that's lobbying. If we look at other countries, it is potentially bribery by firms or by organized crime. So all of this is happening sort of despite the Sustainable Development Goals, which all countries basically have agreed to work to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. They're supposed to do this by 2030. With Joanna and another co-author, we've developed a new index to measure progress on this goal because the existing measures are inadequate. And so for the region, these are the results that we have. What we're doing, basically, we have mapped 21, we've mapped 19 dimensions, types of corruption as measured either by incidents or citizen perceptions or business perceptions or expert perceptions. And we identify whether they have improved significantly. And then we count how many ways, how many types of corruption has this country improved significantly. And so we have 16 of 33, just under half of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean improving significantly in at least one dimension. This is important to recognize because if you look just at the CPI, it's very frustrating when a country is working to make progress, but that progress doesn't show up on the very persistent CPI. So it's important to applaud countries for what progress they may be making. But on the downside, at the world level, we find almost 74% of countries had improved on at least one dimension. So Latin America is lagging in terms of progress. And this is just counting the dimensions on which they've improved significantly. When we discount for the dimensions in which there has been a significant deterioration, it's worse, obviously. So we actually have more countries that have deteriorated than those that have improved. I'm sorry, if you'll allow me just one moment. I'd like to see if I can download these slides because the format has changed terribly. That should be more visible. Excellent. Okay, so the most improved, again, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and Mexico, Haiti, and Ecuador, all improving with 1. But the worst are Guatemala, which should not be a big surprise. Brazil, Uruguay was the biggest surprise for us because Uruguay has...
Professor, you're seeing your presentation view.
Nice. Okay, so this is just a mapping of our MIPAC net results that I just want to point out that we have more red squares, so more deteriorating than green squares, which is improving. The yellow are dimensions for which we have measures, and there's no significant improvement or deterioration. So our data are showing us that overall the region hasn't improved and is deteriorating in terms of corruption in many ways, but there are some points of hope within the region. Now I'm going to turn to some of the emblematic cases that were important a decade ago and to see where they are today. So first up is the CICIG, the International Commission Against Integrity in Guatemala. A decade ago, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala was a model of how effective such organizations could be. A collaboration between the Guatemalan government and the United Nations, CICIG was designed initially to support law enforcement and the judicial system in seeking accountability for crimes committed during a 3-decade civil war. From 2007 to 2019, CICIG worked with the Attorney General's office on 124 cases. They trained investigators. They had an attorney general fired. They helped hire another one, and they brought to justice a number of politicians, business people, and others involved in corruption. So, of those 124 cases, many of them had to do with campaign finance, with corruption in procurement. The Odebrecht case, which we'll look at in a moment, state capture, and they delineated and detangled corrupt networks. That was their specialty, not going after individuals, but going after the entire network, and money laundering. They also submitted 31 policy reform proposals. They trained both investigators and other law enforcement and officials, and they worked closely with the Attorney General's office to bring these cases to trial. They were not allowed to prosecute under Guatemalan law, but they worked closely to build those cases and to help bring justice to Guatemala. So CICIG a decade ago was an international model of what can be accomplished with these state and supranational organizations working together. Lots of articles and books were written about CICIG as a great model. But when CICIG brought the most iconic case that CICIG was involved in was called La Línea. And this was about a network of politicians and business people who were engaged in corruption of many sorts, but mostly involving customs. So the La Línea case resulted in the prosecution of the president, vice president, dozens of politicians, dozens of business people. This case raised awareness about the systemic corruption in the Guatemalan government. And so, seeking a change, voters elected comedian Jimmy Morales president. He was an outsider. He'd run on a strong anti-corruption platform, promising to work closely with CICIG against corruption. But when CICIG began investigating his campaign finances, including his family, he changed his tune and he began attacking CICIG, and especially its head, Iván Velázquez. He declared Velázquez a persona non grata. He tried to ban him from returning to the country when he was abroad, but that was overturned by a judge. He also started a smear campaign in Washington, which resulted in the United States, under the first Trump administration, removing its support, including substantial financial support of CICIG. Finally, Morales refused to sign the contract to renew CICIG's mandate, which was required every 2 years. And so that put an end to the CICIG. So we have, along the way, a number of measures that were taken against the CICIG, including, in the end, removing the security forces, rescinding the right to bear arms of of the CICIG officers. So that's the bad. Now the ugly. In addition to banishing the CICIG, Morales appointed a new attorney general who proceeded to open cases against those who had worked with or for CICIG, as well as journalists and activists who exposed alleged corruption or human rights abuses. She was reappointed by Morales' successor. And so between 2019 and 2024, over 100 such professionals fled the country, including 2 former attorneys general. So we've had these attacks on anti-corruption professionals in Guatemala, and they have been repeated in other countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, the United States. And so there has been this deterioration in law and order and in the institutions, and a state capture, which seems to be turning the corner in Guatemala, maybe. Turning now to the Lava Jato case. So just this was a case that eventually involved both Petrobras and Odebrecht, among other firms in the region. The Odebrecht case caught national headlines. The Bloomberg Business Week said that no one has ever made a corruption machine like this one. Odebrecht had an entire department dedicated to bribery of politicians abroad and at home. The Petrobras scandal was the biggest corruption scandal of the last decade, as declared just this year in Monterrey. So this was a huge case in the region. But I say that a decade ago, this was good. This was good because these are things that were happening, but they came to light and there were consequences. So just to remind you, there was this judicial investigation that began in 2014, and it was looking at money laundering that was occurring near a gas station and a car wash. So it was called the car wash investigation, or Lava Jato. And this led the investigators to look more deeply at Petrobras, which was taking kickbacks, or several officials within Petrobras were taking kickbacks for public procurement contracts. And then those kickbacks, or most of them, were being funneled into the finances of political parties. And this investigation eventually led to Odebrecht and other firms. But those are the main players. And so what's the good that came out of this? The investigative team actually won the anti-corruption award at the International Anti-Corruption Conference in 2016 from Transparency International. They were, again, hailed internationally as excellent, outstanding anti-corruption workers. Sergio Moro, the head of the investigation, was a superstar at home and abroad. Brazil was using plea agreements very effectively, and this was relatively new in Brazil. So people could plead guilty and provide information which led to other guilty parties. And then they were able to build their case and get to the highest levels. And this was, again, seen as a positive development. And there were consequences. 2 presidents were convicted, and a third was charged. But there were consequences in all of the countries that were involved, except Mexico and Venezuela. And so in the midterm, we have the bad. Because of this scandal, as in Guatemala, we have the election of someone who was ostensibly anti-corruption, but who turned out to be more of an autocrat. Jair Bolsonaro was known as the Trump of the tropics, and he recruited Sergio Moro into his government, which turned out to be disastrous. for both of them. Today, many of those cases have been overturned. The judicial sector in Brazil has been dismantling. The whole investigation was closed down by Bolsonaro, but the judicial decisions themselves have been reversed. The jurisdiction of the court of Curitiba that has been called into question, and that has been overturning many others. The use of plea agreements has been called into question. Sergio Moro had been apparently sending messages to the prosecutor general, which is not allowed. And there was apparent bias on his part as well. So everything that he oversaw was declared insubmissible. So that's really bad. And then if we turn to the Panama Papers, this was not quite a decade ago, but this was huge. It was a major leak from a law firm in Panama, Mossack Fonseca, and it revealed not corruption per se, but the money that the rich and powerful were hiding, which in many cases was indicative of illicit enrichment. And so it was enormous. The Panama Papers led to the creation of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which has been doing amazing work throughout the world. They not only are they publishing cases of corruption that are big worldwide and at the national level, but also they've been training journalists to do this work, and they provide funds and help for journalists that suffer legal attacks. It also, led to a nice little movie, inspired the movie The Laundromat. There have been a number of leaks since then: the Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers, FinCEN leaks, FIFA leaks also. And so it's inspired a lot of whistleblowing and leaks are slightly different from whistleblowing, but both of those. If we turn now to the United States, I'm from the United States, so it's painful to talk about this, but it is important to talk about corruption in the United States. So a decade ago, the United States was the world leader in anti-corruption. Going back to 1977, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act gave the United States the ability to prosecute firms for bribing abroad, basically. And that led to the creation of all these international anti-corruption agreements. They also, for years, through USAID and other programs, have supported projects on anti-corruption and pro-democracy, among other types of projects, but I want to focus on the corruption. Under the Biden administration, anti-corruption was given a priority. And among the actions taken by the Biden administration, in 2023, Congress passed the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which goes a step further than the FCPA, allowing the US government to prosecute foreign public officials for receiving bribes from those firms. A decade ago, in 2014, the OECD published a report on where cases were being brought and finalized under the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. The United States was by far the outlier at that time. It was the country that was taking the most legal actions against firms bribing abroad. Today, we'll see. And other countries have stepped up, actually. A number of other countries, the UK in particular, has been very active. So this is all sort of the good stuff, mostly a decade ago. Now, by 2015, the United States was already weakened in anti-corruption, in particular by the Citizens United decision. So in 2010, the Supreme Court decided that campaign donations in money or in kind are a type of expression. And so because freedom of expression is protected in the United States, and because the Supreme Court decided that firms, as legal persons, have all of these rights, that allowed firms and wealthy people to make contributions. And that has completely changed the landscape of politics in the United States, as political parties and individual candidates are have been captured by these wealthy interests. During the first Trump administration, there were serious efforts to weaken or cancel many of these laws, but they weren't very successful at doing so. The FCPA continued to be enforced during the Trump administration. And Trump was impeached twice, but the Senate, which was controlled by the Republicans, refused to condemn him. And also bad was when President Biden pardoned his son preemptively. This is not a good look for a president. And he was following the example of President Trump, who had, during his first administration, pardoned many people who had been condemned for corruption charges or similar. And so, that's not great. But now let's turn to the ugly. Under the new Trump administration, brand new administration, hit the ground running. And so Trump has issued a number of executive orders. I don't know how closely you've been following the news. Some of what's been happening is that he's declared that the FCPA will be enforced only for cases involving organized crime. So basically carte blanche for the firms that aren't technically organized crime. For now, anyway. There's a caveat here. There's a statute of limitations of 5 years for many of the laws that have been that are not being enforced. So there's a chance that right after this administration ends, there could be some reckoning, but it takes a long time to build cases, so it's less likely that will happen. He's been using laws as lawfare, attacking lawyers and law firms, other firms, and universities. For those of you in many parts of Latin America, this might sound familiar because they're tactics that have been used. I live in Mexico. They've been used in Mexico as well. And then there have been massive firings and cutbacks on funding for a number of different areas. But in particular, one of the first moves was to fire 12 inspectors general. So that is accountability of the main government offices. They have been firing the auditors at the IRS, so the wealthy will be able to get away with tax evasion. And what's affecting anti-corruption worldwide is the canceling or at least the suspension of grants around the world. And this has resulted in thousands of organizations around the world not being able to carry out their anti-corruption or pro-democracy efforts, including here at the Javeriana, the Observatorio Fiscal. So the United States has, in the second Trump administration, effectively abdicated its role as an anti-corruption leader. Very quickly, COVID-19. Before COVID-19, we had corruption in the region that meant that many countries had bad healthcare systems in the beginning, hospitals that hadn't been fully built, lack of equipment and medicines. During COVID, then there weren't enough tests, cases, and deaths were not attributed to COVID that should have been attributed to COVID. There were contradictory messages in many countries, Brazil and Mexico in particular. In Brazil, we had Bolsonaro saying COVID's just like a cold. He was echoing what was coming out of the United States. Don't worry about it. But the governors in Brazil stepped up and for the most part, were trying to enforce social distancing and the use of masks. There was inadequate social support, so no unemployment insurance in many countries, which leads to more poverty, which feeds into corruption and organized crime. And then there was also a suspension in many cases of oversight, and that allowed for more corruption in the form of overpricing in procurement, bribes and sextortion to gain access to hospitals or tests, the use of intermediaries. In Mexico, we call these coyotes, to be able to get into hospitals or to get tests or to get good test results, fake test results. Abuse of authority, where you have public officials who are getting shots before the general public. And extortion, once you've had the test done, extortion to be able to receive those results. So those are various types of corruption that occurred. And then the good that comes out of this is that because of the shutdowns in many countries, most countries moved more towards e-government, creating transparency platforms, putting more public services online, creating online whistleblower and reporting mechanisms. And there was a good deal of journalistic reporting throughout the region that revealed all those types of corruption that I've already laid out. I'm going to skip this slide and go straight to mafiocracy. So this is sort of my pet topic. In my book with Susan Rose Ackerman, we argue that there are vicious circles between corruption, organized crime, and money laundering. And so it's very important that we look at all three together, especially in countries like Mexico. You can't really talk about corruption without talking about organized crime. So this is just two examples. Alejandro Arcos was the governor of Tupancingo in Mexico. Fernando Villavicencio was a presidential candidate in Ecuador. Thousands of miles away from each other, they were both assassinated by a Mexican organized crime groups because they were both outspoken against organized crime. And so this is a symptom of the way that organized crime tries to capture and influence states. This is a graph of political violence in Mexico. Those three peaks you see, those are electoral seasons. That's just before the elections. And so we can see that there's definitely a peak moving towards the election, and those are mostly victims who are either I won't get into the reasons right now. This is from the Global Organized Crime Index. So on the vertical axis, we have mafia-style groups. The higher the score, the worse is the influence of mafia-style groups. And then on the x-axis, we have the Corruption Perceptions Index, and the higher the number, the better. The green circles are Latin America, are the Americas. And the size of the circle is the level of democracy. So as we can see, there are many of the circles that are above, say, 7 are green. Those are in the Americas. Latin America is the region that is most affected by organized crime, and especially by mafia-style groups right now. Concluding, because I'm running out of time, to prevent and reduce corruption, we need not just good laws. We need a multi-pronged approach. We need the good laws, yes, but also political will, an effective and independent judiciary, a professional bureaucracy, transparency. But transparency alone isn't going to do it. We need freedom of the press. We need a free and independent press and active civil society to look on those transparency platforms and find what's going wrong. We need powerful firms that are willing to stand up to corruption, and we need cooperation across agencies, countries, and sectors. So a decade ago, things were looking pretty good for anti-corruption, at least in the sense that we were seeing things that had been hidden before. So we have the beginning of the Lavallatos investigation in Brazil. The CICIG was a world model. There were all of these corruption scandals coming out. I didn't even touch on what was happening in Mexico that led to the National Anti-Corruption System being founded. There were these articles being published coming out of the Panama Papers, they were called the Panama Papers, and the United States was a world leader. Today, many of the results from that Lava Jato investigation have been overturned. The CICIG no longer exists, though it has inspired some other similar bodies. The anti-corruption presidents that have been elected, for the most part, have turned out to be facilitating corruption instead. We're still getting results from the Panama Papers, people being tried and in some cases even convicted, but for the most part, we're seeing impunity for those people. And the United States has effectively abdicated its anti-corruption role. So I do want to close by focusing on the good stuff. Investigative journalists have been doing an amazing job despite the dangers that that represents. Civil society in many places has strengthened despite, again, the attacks on civil society organizations, including, well, again, I won't go into those details right now. There have been protests. In the United States, there are protests somewhere every day now. Not just about anti-corruption, but people are standing up and realizing that we need to do something. And there have been some positive results in some elections. For example, the election of Donald Trump led to the election of a more centrist prime minister in Canada. Just this week in Romania, outside the region, we have a case that's very similar to that of Sergio Fajardo, who's going to be speaking on Friday, a math professor, anti-corruption champion who's been elected president there. So there are good things happening. What can we do? We need to educate ourselves, find out what's going on. Tell your students, if you are a professor, to find out what are their politicians doing? What are the firms in your country doing? Look for and expose these cases. When you go to vote, vote responsibly. Know who the candidates are. In Mexico, in June 1st, there are elections for judges. Oh my gosh. It's going to be insane. And we need to watch out for the government. We see what they're doing, hold them accountable. We need to promote the good use of resources. Support civil society. If they've lost funding, try some crowdfunding. And then we also need to support all of the journalistic investigation that is also helping to reveal this. Thank you very much for your attention. I cede the floor.
Gracias, Bonnie, por tu presentación. Si ahora abro el espacio, tenemos todavía 10 minutos para preguntas del público y de la audiencia online. Por favor, entonces, el público, quien tenga una pregunta, nada más alza la mano y ya le rotamos uno de los micrófonos que tenemos acá. Sí, bueno, creo que no tenemos acá para que te vean. Y de la audiencia también, si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, que levante la mano. If someone has questions, please raise your hand. Someone who is online. So, sí. Muchísimas gracias. ¿Nos están escuchando online?
Tenía curiosidad sobre este estudio que están haciendo en conjunto como para saber cuáles son los indicadores de cada país, pero que han mejorado, ¿no? Y para ver si pueden encontrar un poco más al respecto.
¿Está mejorando? Ah, sí. Ay, Giovanna, tú eres mejor que yo para eso.
lo que hicimos, bueno, Giovanna hizo el trabajo. Oh, ok, la pregunta era sobre el MIPAC. Ay, no tengo la lista aquí, pero son diferentes tipos de soborno, incluye extorsión a nivel ejecutivo, legislativo, judicial. También hay uno de sextorsión que todavía no hemos podido calcular porque no tenemos los dos datos, solo se ha levantado una vez. Tenemos, está dividido en dos. Los resultados de encuestas a expertos y al público en general, por un lado, y luego evaluaciones de parte de las empresas. Aquí no tengo las primeras. Y lo que hicimos fue tomar los datos de 2015.
Here with me.
Sido, y luego del 2022 o el año más cercano. Calculamos el cambio significativo en el sentido de que tomamos tomamos la standard deviation, la desviación estándar, y lo ajustamos según el puntaje original de cada uno de los indicadores. Y si el cambio fue mayor a esa desviación estándar ajustado, entonces le asignamos un 1, ¿no? Y luego contamos los unos. Esa fue como que la metodología. Ya lo tenemos en línea, si gusta te paso la liga después.
Oli, muchas gracias por la presentación. Quiero hacerte una pregunta para escuchar tu opinión sobre el over, lo va a ser uno de los puntos finales de la presentación. ¿Cómo se puede, de alguna manera, mejorar el mecanismo para que la función judicial no abuse de ese principio de oportunidad o coyunturalmente del poder político que esté de turno detrás de la función judicial para poder activar casos o archivar casos dependiendo del contexto, los intereses? Yo creo que es uno de los problemas más neurálgicos que hay dentro de los trials, de los juicios y de la ejecución penal de la corrupción.
Bueno, creo que estás hablando de dos temas. Uno es de lawfare y otro es el criterio de oportunidad, ¿no?
Me refiero al criterio de oportunidad porque son los fiscales o los jueces los que deciden cuándo activar un juicio y cuándo no.
Ya.
Y a la final, el lawfare termina siendo, ¿no?, sus intereses que se encuentran detrás de cuándo archivo o cuándo actúo el proceso.
Entonces es la combinación entre que si le doy esa oportunidad o si sigo con el caso judicial, ¿verdad?
¿Cómo se puede mejorar ese mecanismo?
Bueno, siempre tiene que haber rendición de cuentas de algún sentido, ¿no? Entonces los jueces, si están abusando de sus funciones y se puede comprobar, debe haber un cuerpo, bien sea judicial o congresional, que lleve a cabo esa rendición de cuentas, ¿no? Que los jueces también, o sea, Sergio Moro hoy en día es representante, o sea, ya no es juez, por decisión propia, creo, pero no sé bien. Tal vez su idea es que tiene que cambiar la política en el país y esa es su misión ahora. Pero, ¿cómo evitar? Yo tampoco soy abogada, entonces no sé, tal vez algunos abogados tendrían una mejor idea sobre cómo hacerle, pero ahí también entra la investigación periodística y decir, ¿sabes qué? Aquí hay un patrón, que este juez en particular está tomando decisiones que otros jueces no tomarían. ¿Y por qué? ¿Hay otra pregunta atrás?
I would like to ask you about the Uruguay case that you told it to background. Does it mean that the CPI is published on some countries? Because you showed that they lost a lot with your index, and but in the same time they gained with the CPI. So what is it yours? It's yours, or is it the CPI?
So we're measuring different things. Some of the sources that we use, I'm sorry, the question was over the case of Uruguay and why our MIPAC net is showing Uruguay deteriorating, but the CPI is improving. We haven't looked closely at the Uruguayan case yet. So I'm not sure why our results are showing this decline when the CPI is improved, but it's not a statistically significant improvement. Okay, so by the CPI, Uruguay is the same, right? It's holding steady. And Uruguay a decade ago was the shining star of Latin America, right? And it was written about in numerous books and articles because it had improved significantly over the previous 2 decades. And so I don't have a good answer, but anecdotally, I've heard that that improvement was driven in large part by some civil society organizations, and that they have not worked to renew their membership. And so they're aging and they're not as actively involved as they were. And that's opened some space for corruption to sneak in. But when we finally write up the article on Latin America, we are going to dive deeper into Uruguay. Ok, sí, la pregunta es sobre el término de mafiocracia y cómo se diferencia de la presencia del crimen organizado, ¿sí? Básicamente, la mafiocracia, en algunos lugares se usa el término narcoestado. A mí no me gusta tanto ese término porque el crimen organizado va más allá del narcotráfico. Es la captura del Estado de parte del crimen organizado. Entonces puede haber grupos criminales en una región que se dedican principalmente a sus actividades económicas, ¿no? El narcotráfico, tráfico de armas, tráfico de seres humanos, el movimiento de migrantes, etcétera. Pero sus actividades corruptas se limitan a pagar sobornos a los policías y oficiales y políticos locales. Cuando llega a ser captura del Estado es porque el crimen organizado pretende influir en las elecciones directamente y también en las políticas y la aplicación de las políticas y las leyes. Esto lo hacen a través de campañas a favor de ciertos candidatos, amenazas y actos violentos hacia otros.
El nombre del sitio, perdón, según el procedimiento global.
Comprando el voto o amenazando a ciudadanos para votar para cierto candidato y eventualmente lanzando a sus propios candidatos para ocupar puestos electorales y otros puestos del gobierno. En ese sentido, ya el Estado es capturado porque ya están influyendo en las leyes y en el punto extremo ya legalizaron sus prácticas. Entonces, por ejemplo, la legalización de casinos muchas veces es porque el crimen organizado quiere poder lavar más fácilmente su dinero. Pueden influir en reducir la prescripción de actos de corrupción o de otros tipos. Pueden influir en la posibilidad de que el país extradite a las personas miembros del crimen organizado. En muchos países ya tienen capturados también los cárceles, ¿no? Que es otro asunto. Hay uno en el chat. Is relations, anti-corruption relations practice and yeah, actually, I'll answer in English because the question's in English, but the question is about anti-corruption's practice and the new president of Mexico, I guess. It's still a little bit early. This president is doing some things, I think, a little bit better than López Obrador, who was significantly weakening the institutions, the anti-corruption institutions, and attacking what he called the elite, universities, journalists, etc. Under the new president, there are fewer such attacks, but some of the laws that are changing are not good, and there's still a weakening of institutions. So, for example, several of the autonomous institutions that were part of the national anti-corruption system have actually been canceled or absorbed by the executive branch, where they are no longer autonomous and independent. So we're keeping an eye on what's happening in Mexico. Thank you very much.